This is the fourth week of the IFs of Jesus kind of thing. We did a week in Matthew and one in John and one in Mark. And we're going to be in Luke 11 if you want to go ahead and turn there. There's actually 8 ifs in the chapter. The first 4 are the ones we're going to look at, and actually they all kind of like connect together into one. So we're not going to tear apart all 4 of them, so to speak, as you'll see. But it's an interesting chapter. As the chapter begins, Jesus' disciples, actually, why don't we read that verse?
Now Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples."
So it's kind of like when I hear that, I don't know why, I kind of hear the request is being made of Jesus to kind of be and do something he's not. In other words, can't you be like John? Here's how John taught John taught his disciples. You haven't taught us. So can you be like John? Can you teach us to pray like John taught his? It's just kind of an interesting thing to me. And it kind of says to me this, discipleship hasn't changed much. Do you really have to be that kind of Lord? I mean, can't we do it this way? Can't you do it like, the old time Pentecostals or what? So it's kind of interesting. The chapter for me starts in an interesting way of a request that's a good request. They want to, learn how to pray. We don't know where they were, what they were doing. It says he finished praying in a certain place. So most likely they overheard him and thought, not for anything, but he hasn't really taught us how to pray. And John did. And, it's not a bad thing. It's just it's kind of a funny start to me for the chapter. And consequently, Jesus gives them what we call the Lord's Prayer. And a lot of times we don't really think like this, but it's true. Jesus said the same thing in a variety of different places. In other words, the Lord's Prayer that is in Matthew is is part of the Sermon on the Mount. This is not the Sermon on the Mount. This is another time, another place, and only one disciple approaches him about prayer. And he gives them the same prayer that he would have given them back at the Sermon on the Mount when he brought the Lord's Prayer in. So some people see it as parallel, but it is 2 different places, 2 different times, and all of that. So he gives them the Lord's Prayer, which I think everybody in the room can probably, recite. Right off the Lord's Prayer, the very next thing is the parable of the friend who comes at midnight. And this we really do need to read to give the parable. And listen to it closely, because I'm going to ask you what you think when it's over. Okay? So let's read the parable. Verses 5 through 8.
Then he said to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, and goes to him at midnight, and says, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. For a friend of mine who is on a journey has come to visit me, and I have nothing to serve him.' And from inside he answers, 'Do not bother me. The door has already been shut, and my children and I are in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything just because he is his friend, yet because of his persistence and boldness, he will get up and give him whatever he needs."
Okay. Any thoughts, anything about what you just heard in that parable that Jesus taught? And this is what I really want to do today, because we often chop up chapters. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We just often do it. And we kind of miss something that's actually happening. Teach us to pray like John did. So, Jesus gives them the Lord's Prayer and immediately goes right into this parable. So this is all connected. It really shouldn't be chopped up. It's all connected. He gives them this parable following the Lord's Prayer. There's a bread connection, isn't there?
Lend me 3 loaves of bread.
Yeah. Give us this day our daily bread. Guy goes to his friend at midnight. Can I have some bread? Stay on the Jesus trail here. What's actually happening and being said. Just to add a little bit to this is not unusual. The parable's not unusual. In the sense that they traveled at night because it's so hot in the Middle East. So somebody to arrive at midnight to your home was not necessarily unusual. To be caught without bread was not necessarily unusual either, but it was kind of tough because the Jews were huge on hospitality. We like coming together and eating together, So the Jews were huge on hospitality. So even though we're talking about daily bread, I mean, these people it's not like us with refrigerators and freezers. They made a loaf of bread or whatever they made for the day, and it was gone by midnight. So the guy, there's nothing negative about this parable, and it's been taught and preached in so many different ways. Well, the guy was caught off guard. No, there's nothing negative. Jesus isn't trying to paint a negative picture of the guy who doesn't have any bread. That would have been normal. And somebody coming at midnight, that all this stuff is culturally normal. And even going to his friend's house and asking him for bread, okay, the guy not wanting to get up, that's normal. Most of their homes would have been 2 levels. They would bring all their animals in at night. They would stay on the ground floor level. The family would go to the 2nd level where there was a fire going or something like that, and they would all sleep around the fire, the father, the mother, the children. So you can imagine a guy having to get from the 2nd level through all the animals to get to the door. He knows everybody in the house is going to be awake. It's not very convenient. He doesn't dislike the guy, but to have to go through all that to bring him some bread that for some reason he has that the other guy doesn't, okay? Jesus is just telling this story. And the guy does it because there's a persistence. So if I don't get up and make my way from the upper level through the animals and give this guy some bread, all of his banging on the door is going to wake up the kids anyway. If you kind of picture this whole thing. It doesn't sound like a very spiritual kind of thing. Not in terms of how Jesus usually, we get these dynamic spiritual truths, but teach us to pray like John did. And Jesus they didn't ask him, teach us what to pray. They said, as John. As John, he gives them a what to pray. He's still working on a teaching on prayer here. He's not trying to prescribe a Lord's Prayer that 2,000 years later everybody would recite. That's not his goal. His goal is to teach on prayer itself. Not necessarily as John taught. Remember, Old Testament prayers are canned prayers. They're not extemporaneous. They are canned prayers. They recite prayers, much like in the Roman Catholic Church today. Most Roman Catholics are turned to recite a prayer. Jesus gives them a prayer that can be recited if you want, because that's as John taught. But there's something else Jesus is driving at here. And he's not into recitation, methodology, or anything else. He's doing something else here. But we got to hold on to the chapter to catch it. Otherwise, we teach these parables as separate, and then we go to this next section. He's still working on prayer. How did the Lord's Prayer begin? Our Father. Now he brings him to a parable. That's not his father in the house. That's a friend of his. So, he's saying this guy goes to his friend, and he's wanting something from his friend. Again, nothing negative about any of this, just a setting. That's all it is a parable setting. But it seems to be out of context with the prayer he just gave him. We don't pray, our friend who art in heaven. We pray, our Father. He's given them something. But then he brings them to a parable that has nothing to do with the Father. It has to do with a friend. And the context of the parable is still prayer. You go to a friend and ask him for something. And the bottom line, we're still looking at bread, like Carol said. The bread is flowing here, the thread of bread. The bread is flowing, but Jesus is doing something with relationships at the same time. We don't go to our friend, we go to our Father. But he brings a parable about a friend. If you go to a friend, and he lays it out there. He's really developing something about provision, whatever it might be, bread, but also relationship. If you're kind of like following me, he's teaching on relationship, the fatherhood, sonship, and that's entirely different than friendship. Now, I'm not saying being a friend of God or considering God our friend is bad. It's a very good thing, actually. One of the things Jesus says to the guys at the end of his ministry, John 15, I call you friends. This is wonderful friendship. But Jesus is not teaching on friendship. He's teaching on prayer, and that last line is very powerful. So, do you want to go to a friend? Or do you want to go to a father? Now, I don't know how they're piecing all this together. And I've heard people take this parable to talk about persistence. You've got to be persistent with God. You got to pound that throne room, man. You just got to go and go and go. Pound and pound until he finally says, for crying out loud, let me get up and do something for this guy. completely missing the point. The parable is the opposite of God. It's not a representation of God. It's a representation of friends, how friends might treat each other. You got to be a pain in the you-know-what, because friendship itself won't demand that I go much beyond what I really want to go beyond. But going to our Father, that's kind of what he's working his way towards for all of our benefit. Now, I've said many times before, you've heard me say it, I love the song, I am a friend of God, and everybody's singing and jumping around and having a great time. I often wonder what they mean by that. I really would like to hear, what does that actually mean, to be a friend of God and to call God your friend? But in the context of prayer, Jesus is saying the opposite of what he just said in the prayer. This is, you pray, our Father. You go to your Father, not as a friend. You go to your Father. The parable is in contrast. It's not supposed to be a similarity. It's supposed to be in contrast. He's doing a teaching here on prayer. It's not, my will be done. Give me 3 loaves of bread, my friend. It's not my will be done. In the best context, it might be going to a friend and saying, I've got somebody else that just came to my house and I've got no bread. If you can do anything at all, I could use the help. The whole prayer, the whole parable is kind of like intention right now. And Jesus knows exactly what he's doing and why. We want to learn what John was passing on to his disciples. Interesting. You want to maintain the old. You want to stay in that kind of, you want to esteem the person you're going to in prayer as a friend. So he goes into this thing about ask, verses 9 and 10. We should read this, I guess.
So I say to you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open.
Again, he gave them a what in the Lord's Prayer. Now he's kind of working his way into how, but it's connected to the parable, because that's what the guy did. He didn't have something. He had to get up and seek the place where he knew there was bread, his buddy's house. He gets there and he asks for bread. And he knocks on the door. So the whole thing is connected to the previous parable. If you just take the ask, seek, and knock thing, you kind of miss how Jesus is actually doing this teaching. He's still commenting on what the guy did in the parable. He's not putting it down. He's just saying, this is how you can approach prayer. If someone's close to you, you can ask them.